one of the things I was going to say in opening in anyway, so if you're joining, you're basically joining into this conversation, is that it feels really suiting to have you joining us, in that having sort of the author of Our Final Century and the author of The Precipice feels like it perfectly bookends a discrete period of research on this. Because, I mean, there's been quite a few really interesting books written in the period between Our Final Century and now. Ole Hegstrom's book, Nick and Milan Serkovich's book, the collection of chapters on global catastrophic risk. Phil Torres has written some excellent books. Julian Cribb has, and Thomas Moynihan recently. But it feels like arguably, I would say The Precipice is perhaps the most significant of the recent spate of books, and it's been receiving such fantastic reviews. And as well as being kind of a great piece of work in its own right, it nicely draws on a decade or more of research from FHI and elsewhere, and encapsulates a lot of, I think, the key insights from that period. So it feels like a really nice way to kind of bring up to date some of the ideas that were sort of initiated, if you will, with Our Final Century back in 2003.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it owes a great debt to all of the work over that time period. And yes, part of what I was trying to do really is to encapsulate what we know so far, and a lot of this really interesting thinking, a lot of which doesn't always see the light of day in academic papers and so forth. Things that seem like common knowledge on the corridor may not be in the wider world. So I wanted to try to write a lot of that down and get it out there, and also to look back further. I was really interested in the talks today on the kind of prehistory of existential risk and global catastrophic risk. And that's something that I'm very interested in as well. So I think I think that the first kind of real, in my view, there was some thought started around about the time of The Origin of Species, at which point, there was a kind of occasional pieces by people contemplating that the lengths of time that the Earth had been around, and that many species go extinct, and that we are a species, and maybe this would happen to us. And then the next kind of big event, I think, was the atomic bomb, and a lot of thinking that immediately triggered about existential risk. Although at the time it was unclear what the mechanism would be. But people started thinking about it as soon as the bomb was in progress, even though, an individual bomb, it's not that people would be killed in nuclear explosions, or at least not that we'd go extinct through a series of such explosions. We're too widely dispersed across the planet. People first thought maybe the radioactive fallout would do it. But that turned out not to be the case either.
One of the stories that you pick up on in the book is the concern that, I think this is right, that there was a potential that an atomic explosion might ignite the atmosphere.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And just the idea of having to reason around a potential unprecedented effect that would have truly existential consequences. In some ways, it feels like that's the first time scientists have had to deal with a prospect of quite that magnitude.
Yeah, and a particularly big magnitude, because it would have destroyed all complex life on Earth, probably. I'm not sure if it would have destroyed everything all deep into the oceans and so forth, but it's entirely plausible. Maybe some extremophile bacteria would have survived or something, but it would be an event larger than most existential risks that we consider today. It's interesting because it's something that turned out to be physically impossible. The heat from the explosion would dissipate fast enough that it couldn't cause fusion of the atmosphere. But they weren't sure of that at the time. They thought that was right, and they were kind of correct. But they weren't certain, and some of them went to a great deal of effort in order to try to calculate right up until the last minute, such as Fermi. But others, were a bit more blasé, like Hans Bethe. And I think it's also very interesting that no democratic officials were involved in the decision. the kind of military scientific enterprise of Los Alamos kept their cards very close to their chest on that, which I think is pretty shocking. And they did have the best scientists, but there was no peer review. I mean, there couldn't be. But one response, if there can't be any peer review of your calculations that are making sure that you're not destroying the world, would then therefore be not to proceed with that experiment, rather than to say, well, look, no one could look at this, so I guess we had to do what we did. Especially as a lot of those scientists who joined the project when they were rightly scared that Hitler would have unrivaled access, if he got nuclear weapons first and held the world to nuclear blackmail. But by the time of the Trinity test, Hitler was dead in his bunker, and the Germans were being routed. So there was no real fear of losing the war at that point. Similar to the debates about whether the bombs should have been dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Trinity test itself was something that some of the atomic scientists, seriously thought there was still an really important open possibility it would destroy the world. And it wasn't in order to win World War II at that point. So it was, I think that's quite remarkable. But then the actual, physically possible, we think, mechanism for nuclear weapons causing an existential risk is through nuclear winter. And that was discovered quite interestingly in the 1980s, just after the research that showed that a asteroid winter had destroyed the dinosaurs. That was in 1980. And then it was in kind of in 1982, 83 that the nuclear winter models came out. And there's been a kind of complex kind of cross-pollination between those two different disciplines, where the atmospheric models one use, get used by the other. And that's something where I think that's another really important time in the history of existential risk, because in 1982, Jonathan Schell wrote, I think it's The Fate of the Earth, a really fantastic book that is the first writing that really gets clear this idea that Martin mentioned in the work of Derek Parfit, that there's this kind of discontinuity in how bad a catastrophe could be if it destroyed the very last people, and thus wasn't a mere dark age in human history, but the end of human history. And then Carl Sagan follows that up the next year in 83, and then Parfit's book came out in 84. And I actually tried to find out, if Parfit was influenced by these things, and but a little bit too late. He died while I was writing the book. He was my supervisor, and so we were due to talk about it. But his sister told me that yes, he definitely had read Schell, and everyone had, is what she said. He was heavily involved in the anti-nuclear movement. So that kind of cluster of people and ideas, and kind of really starting to understand not just the catastrophic, but the existential risk, was a really big change in 82, 83, 84. And then I think John Leslie's book in 96 and Nick Bostrom's work, broadening it from extinction risk to existential risk. And that was just at the same time, basically, that Martin's book came out. So I think that's the kind of how I see this kind of prehistory. And then, for an even more detailed view, as he said, Thomas Moynihan's book, X Risk, is basically the intellectual history of existential risk, and goes much further again. I mean, I'd encourage people to get a hold of that.
My copy just arrived on my desk this week, so I'm really looking forward to reading it. And from what I've heard, it's absolutely fantastic. I've seen a presentation from him, so I definitely recommend that. So we had fun earlier, sort of needling Martin a little bit on whether he felt like he'd won or lost his bet with Steven Pinker on whether there would be a biological catastrophe of a certain scope by 2020, and a few of the things he felt that he might have got wrong or changed his mind about since 2003. I'm curious about whether there's anything equivalent for you. You've been involved in this field for nearly as long, a good 15 years at this point. Is there anything which, if I went back in time and gave 2005 Toby Ord a copy of The Precipice, that 2005 Toby Ord would be really surprised by?
So there's definitely things I would be surprised by generally. As while writing it, I certainly came across a lot of things I didn't already know. But I think in terms of really surprised by, I would certainly be interested to see that that's what I was working on. Back in the early days, I was I'd always been interested in really big ethical questions, and global poverty was the main thing that moved me. And Derek Parfit was very influenced by both those global issues. And I was a bit more skeptical, it all certainly sounded very exciting to think about the end of the world, and it sounded on the face of it like, I guess if you think about how many lives are at stake and so on, that it would be just fantastically important. But there seemed to be something almost kind of immature about the whole thing. I mentioned in The Precipice that the idea of the end of humanity is often reserved for kind of like cliched comic book plots and things like this. You do get cases back in the Cold War where Bob Dylan and others wrote very poignantly about this, and people treated it like an important topic that poetry and discussions of the human condition would discuss. Whereas more recently, I think that had kind of influenced me a bit to think, can this really be so important if the moral authorities I look up to aren't working on this? And if you tell people down the pub that this is what you're interested in, or might be the biggest question facing humanity, they tend to laugh. And so I think what I tried to do with The Precipice was, over that intervening time, I realized that it's often presented in a kind of contrarian manner, and also we're influenced by this pop culture approach to it. And that had kind of, made me see this kind of very mathsy kind of, very technical kind of subject. Whereas the complete destruction of humanity and all of our projects and everything that our civilization has worked across the globe to build up, this entire legacy being squandered, is obviously something that everyone has a stake in, and that should be of great interest to if I just think about my parents, they should be deeply moved and find this very important, so long as they thought that there really was at stake and there really was something we could do about it. So I tried to just present a case that didn't sound contrarian and that also kind of had this humanistic aspect to it. And so I think that's one of the things I'd be most surprised by, or something that, oh, yeah, okay, of course this is important. I'd been kind of just getting confused about this aspect of, it looks on the face important, but maybe not, because of these strange ways it's treated socially.
That's really interesting. So I've been interested in this kind of intuitive thing as well. So I've some sort of intuition that there were generations that lived through the Cold War and for whom the idea of a real global scale calamity was a very salient prospect. And I've met many of them who really played important roles. I mean, we heard from Francesco from Pugwash before, and I've met others who just did really important things during that time. But I feel like it's harder for these ideas to feel salient for those of us who were born a little bit too late and didn't experience the idea that you could have a global nuclear exchange, and the idea that your entire world could be turned upside down in the blink of an eye. And I nearly feel like that's starting to change a little bit now. Now, I'm obviously not claiming that COVID-19 is a global catastrophe or an existential risk. It's not, but it's closer to that scale than a lot of us, particularly in this part of the world, have experienced within our lifetimes. And it's come with bigger transformational societal shifts in response to a crisis than a lot of us have experienced in our lifetimes. And I feel like now there are conversations I'm having with people in policy, people in research, and just kind of people on the street that I don't feel I could have had 2 years ago, for example. I don't know if you found anything similar. I'm curious, for example, are you finding that discussions around the book's topics, that you're getting more traction than you might have expected to, or maybe that you would have gotten if the book had been released a year previously?
Yeah, I think that's right. Including that early part about how people who lived through the Cold War get this at some kind of deeper level. And I, it's taken me longer to kind of unearth that, and also to realize that there's these roots of even say Derek Parfit's work. I mean, he uses the example of nuclear war, but it's still quite abstract. But then those ones that immediately preceded it, this came out of the realization about nuclear winter, and sometimes one thinks, well, this sounds so outlandish. How are you going to get people kind of marching in the streets, to, force change, on these issues? And could they ever do that? Are these the kinds of issues that are just too abstract to move people or something? But then it's, to look at the history of this and see that, say, the anti-nuclear marches in Central Park in America in the 80s, just before the end of the Cold War, were the biggest marches in that country's history. So, at that point, the biggest thing that had moved people was this threat of nuclear war. And then, but that was in the 80s, and it had taken them about 40 years since the first realization, the development of this threat and the first realization it could be an existential risk to reach that level. And then I think similarly with climate change, we've now got to this issue where it's probably the biggest marching on the streets issue of our time. Although it's taken a bit of a back foot with COVID and the ability to march on the streets. But again, that's taken many decades to get there. But it shows that these issues can have this kind of resonance. And I think that one of the important ideas about global catastrophic risk and existential risk is that at some level, that they are more abstract. They're one level more abstract, right? It's the category that includes nuclear war and that includes climate catastrophe. But it's really important to have this wider thing, because we don't fundamentally care that much whether we're killed by an asteroid or whether we're killed by nuclear war or extreme climate change. What's important is that it's the end. And we'd like to be able to not wait 40 years for the next one of these things to happen, but rather to be able to build a movement around protecting humanity's long-term potential or protecting civilization. Rather than that. So and then COVID-19, yeah, I think even for me, there is this strange difference that kind of shouldn't exist, but between knowing that there is a kind of pretty reasonable probability that something like this will happen in the next few years, and then actually having that happen. I think this is related to what Martin said about Nate Silver's quote about the don't confuse the unfamiliar with the improbable. And maybe that's easier for people who had gone through the Blitz, or this is probably the biggest global issue or something since World War II. And it's just pretty difficult, or like, as in thing that actually happened, as opposed to the looming threat of nuclear war. And it's hard to, there is something different about when you're on the other side of that compared to when it hasn't happened yet. And you just think, yeah, but, and so I think that really has that kind of ineffable aspect about when a probability turns out to become a reality. I think will wake a lot of people up, and I've been having similar conversations on that.
One of the things I really liked about the book, and I think this relates to an important point you made earlier, and something that came through in some of what the other speakers are talking about, is this idea of preventing existential risk is important, but we can also do something about it. It's very easy to think that it is just a really big thing and we can't do anything about it. But the book is full of quite specific things that when you look at it, you think it's kind of ridiculous that we're not doing that. So, I mean, building on some of the things that Francesco talked about, and sort of the weakening of international treaties and norms, you flag renewing the New START Treaty, restarting the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. I mean, these are steps that can be recommended to policymakers, particularly if we have the ear of a sensible US administration. There's some really interesting ones in the biological threats category. I mean, you highlight just how underfunded relative to the scale of the threat the Biological Weapons Convention is. You have this very nice sort of comparison that it's funded less than the average McDonald's when you consider number of staff who are full-time who are involved.
That is right.
And there are any number of others. So, I mean, one of the nice things is these are things that we can lobby for. These are things that we can make recommendations about, that we can actually make a difference about. On the other hand, to really get to this kind of state of existential security that you're talking about will require an awful lot more. I mean, we need a lot of investment into, I mean, everything from better ways of asteroid deflection to better ways of identifying and preventing pandemic disease spread to a whole load else. And one of the things that's been coming in my conversations with people around this is just how challenging it is to invest in prevention and invest in spare capacity with public money. Again, I'm drawing on, I won't say like who or which governments, but this is a thing that comes up. How do you build on kind of crises like these where there is a new momentum behind preparing for crises, to that kind of investment in long-term capacity, both in terms of investing for specific risks, but also, as you mentioned in the book, investing in better horizon scanning, in long-term institutions, in the kind of international bodies that really allow you to coordinate on global risk?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult. As you mentioned, one thing I found it really useful to be able to give in the book, some people think, well, maybe this issue is just completely intractable. Like there's just no way to get traction at all. And, and sure, it's a giant problem. You've convinced me of that. But is it the biggest thing that, we should be working on? Because it might just be a giant problem we can't affect. And then showing that there are examples like renewing the New START Treaty, which is due to lapse in February, I think, next year, and which Trump had let kind of, he didn't re-sign it, and planned to let it lapse, despite the fact that the Russians wanted to renew it. And because he'd also let the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty lapse, then this would be the first time in, I think it's like 50 years or more, that there would be no limits to how many nuclear weapons they could possess. So at least no bilateral limits. I guess this new UN treaty would say that the limit is 0, but the US is not paying attention to that. That was pretty shocking. But that can just be re-signed, really with the stroke of a pen. And the INF treaty can be renewed quite easily too. So these are some examples to show that you can move from where we are to something a bit better, with some actions that are fairly easy to take. Maybe not for an individual on the street, but at least for people in power. But then you're right that there's this huge gap between building on, doing these kind of bare minimum things, funding the BWC to a level higher than a typical McDonald's and so on. But then how do you get from there to the point where I think we need to get to, which I call existential security, where existential risk, the risk from different threats has been brought very low, and the institutions have been put in place to keep it low forever. Institutions kind of including just the idea that there is a moral imperative to do that, and that we all agree on that moral imperative. As we've started to agree that, for example, there are important reasons to, protect the environment. Not everyone, makes the trade-offs in the same way, but everyone agrees. You don't find the leaders, even on political parties that aren't very environmentalist, saying actually there's no duty to the environment. They all agree that there is some kind of duty to the environment. They just want to not do much about it. And at least getting to that level where some people care a lot. I think one important aspect, perhaps a difference with environmentalism, is that environmentalism got politically polarized. It didn't start off that way, I think Nixon and Ronald Reagan both, for example, had some good things to say about environmentalism. I think Reagan said it's not a left or right issue; it's an everyone issue. And then Nixon started the EPA. So then it became polarized. And then all of a sudden, half the people, in political power were dragging their heels a lot on it and treating it as a victory for the other side if something got implemented. So I think that's an area where we want to be very careful. There's room for a lot of action in the next few years, but we want to be very careful not to just have it be associated, I think, with one side in politics.
Yeah, and it's a very, very hard thing to manage that risk. I mean, my mind still boggles that in the US, pandemic response is now a partisan issue. I mean, I just can't quite wrap my head around that. And luckily, that's happened to a much lesser extent here. I would love to talk about that more. I realize we're getting fairly close to the end of what was a short session. I could speak to you all day about this. I did want to sort of end on a slightly optimistic note and also give you a chance to respond to a comment that Martin made earlier on. So he referred to the idea that comes late in your book of following existential security, the idea of a long reflection, a period in which humanity would be fairly stable, and we as kind of a global collective community could really take the time to think through what it is we value and what it is we want for our species. And Martin expressed some pessimism about this idea. He said that he sees the kind of relentless drive towards scientific and technological progress of humanity making the idea of just kind of taking this sort of time out seem somewhat unrealistic to him. So I wanted to sort of give you a chance to respond and basically ask, what makes you optimistic? What makes you think that, you know, we could do this as a collective global community?
Well, yeah, no, I heard his remark on that, and had been thinking a bit about this. I mean, one thing to say at first is that, so I split up our kind of grand strategy for humanity into these three phases. There's reach or achieve existential security, so get ourselves into this safe position, and then have this long reflection where we work out ultimately what is the best way of fulfilling our potential, and then the part three is actually implement that plan. And one of the reasons I do that actually is something that Martin would probably be entirely in agreement with, which is sometimes you get debates about, is existential risk more important than solving this kind of deep problem about ethics, such as machine consciousness, you know, could that really be important or something? Or what about if you could have an infinite amount of value, maybe that's even more important than existential risk? And instead to say, no, both of those things, they could well be extremely important, but we need to survive this time. You know, our crucial task, the most time limited task, is to survive first, and then we could sort out those things, and we could, you know, we could do them second, whereas it doesn't really work the other way around. You know, this is the task of our time, is achieving existential security. So that's kind of the main reason I put them in there, is in order to be able to kind of kick the can down the road a bit on some other important issues. But I do think that it's also more of me saying, here's what would be best. Here's how we, you know, humanity should do this. If we were kind of sitting there playing a kind of civilization style game or something, and you just kind of were in control, this is a sensible strategy for what you would do. Then it's useful to occasionally say, okay, good. Can we achieve that? Or what steps should we take to achieve that? I think that ultimately this would be, I think even existential security would be a bit like setting a constitution for humanity. That setting the kind of constraints in which we would go forward. And I do think that something like that over a century timescale is a plausible goal. I mean, if you look back a century ago, I guess we just had the League of Nations, you know, you know, a century and a couple of years, and there'd been no kind of such forms of world alliances. You know, maybe in another 100 years from now, we will at least be able to have a very small delimited area that we're not allowed to go into, which is the areas around recklessly producing existential risk. And we'll make commitments that other things are all possible, but that is something that's off the table going anywhere near that. And, you know, maybe then we could kind of say aspects such as unilaterally going off and settling other planets in a way that kind of could just kind of disappear out into the cosmos and create and splinter humanity, or genetically engineering ourselves into radically different species that might then be in perpetual conflict, that those things are off the table until we've got a form of governance for how we deal with them. And I think that most people would agree that that's probably a good idea. And so maybe we need to kind of make these agreements sufficiently far ahead of time that we're behind the veil of ignorance about who would be the unilateral actor. And we're all aware that it'd be bad to have such a unilateral actor. And maybe then we could make such agreements. But I agree that that's a long way out. This is not something to do in the next 5 years. This is just thinking about what we need to do over the next 50 years.
Thanks very much. I think that is a very compelling vision, and one that I'd love to see us work towards. I do apologize, I didn't get time to get onto the question of population and environmental resources. There is a section of The Precipice which deals with this, particularly with the concept of environmental overreach and the concern that there may be kind of ill-defined risks in this space as we move into using more resources than we've ever done before. And Toby does draw on the literature that points out that the rate of population expansion is slowing, but we are still looking at 11 billion people on the planet at some point this century, which is an unprecedented situation. Toby also has a fascinating and somewhat provocative chapter from a couple of years ago in a book called Is Our Planet Full, which dealt with the overpopulation issue, where Toby looks at both the kind of intrinsic and informational value of lives and the soft and hard limits. So if people are interested in Toby's thoughts on that particular issue, it's, there's some really interesting literature out there, but that is more than unfortunately we have time for today. I highly recommend to everybody to take a look at The Precipice, which I believe is currently sold out, Toby.
It's yeah, sorry about that. It's sold out in America on Amazon because of the pandemic. It should be available in other bookstores in America and in other countries. But they've printed off more copies, and finally the printing presses are sufficiently free of pandemic or something that they've managed to. But it's a bit crazy having a book on existential catastrophes that then gets kind of sidetracked, or kind of by a global pandemic.
Well, it sounds like the book is going to be back on shelves, so I highly recommend the book. Thank you so much, Toby, for joining us. If you missed the introduction, Toby Ord is a research leader at Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute and a leading thinker in this space. To remind everyone, we'll be starting again tomorrow. This is the book, The Precipice. We'll be starting again tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. with a session on assessing the chances of a global catastrophe, which again is one of the key topics in The Precipice. And we'll see if our experts tomorrow, Nancy Connell and Karim Jawari, agree or disagree with the estimates that Martin, Toby, and various others have provided on these. And well, please do all join us tomorrow for some more excellent discussions, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Good night.